The entire Bridgewater, Tennessee community is overwhelmed by fear and suspicions when they learn that 39-year-old Veronica Boza has been murdered in her home.
If this could happen to Veronica, this could happen to anybody.
And before anyone will feel safe again, detectives have to crack one of the toughest cases they've ever seen.
We didn't have a confession. We didn't have a smoking gun.
The investigation into this brutal crime is filled with unexpected plot twists.
Is Veronica's killer right here in this room?
Greed, jealousy, revenge.
Sounds like a bad Hollywood movie.
How well do you know your neighbors? What lies behind the white picket fence? Just beyond the acoustic thumping of country music's rollicking capital, Nashville, Tennessee, sits the quiet neighborhood of Bridgewater. An ideal upscale hideaway overflowing with idyllic southern charm.
Bridgewater is a little bit east of Nashville, and it's a close-knit community of new homes with a lot of amenities, lots of families, very safe, secure neighborhood feel to the whole area.
So we're just far enough out to enjoy the benefits of small town and not the hustle and bustle of Nashville.
For music producer Veronica Boza, Bridgewater's the perfect setting for a new beginning after a 16-year marriage with her soon-to-be ex-husband, Timothy.
Great neighborhood, right?
As Veronica's divorce was being finalized, she really started to blossom. Everything in her life was going really well.
And the area provides a healthy, comforting atmosphere to raise their 9-year-old son, Jordan. The two were fixtures at the community pool.
Veronica, she would lay out and get some sun, while Jordan and our granddaughters would play in the pool.
The dazzling Italian beauty has the it factor.
Veronica was born in Italy, and she came here to Nashville, Tennessee, to the United States to fulfill her dream.
She was that Italian nobility. I always admired her beauty. She was friendly, she was nice, she was highly educated.
It's a compelling storyline. The striking Italian newcomer falls in love with American country music and makes her mark on the industry.
Veronica was a music producer for CMT, and she had a bright future ahead of her. She worked on a lot of projects with a lot of big stars, and the world was just at her feet. She could have been anything.
Although unlucky with love her first go-round, the busy, soon-to-be divorced mom still believes in it when she meets Chris Orlando.
Veronica met Chris on a television show, Can We Duet? And Chris was also a producer, and so they had a lot in common, and the relationship just blossomed.
If Veronica's life were a country music video, she'd be walking into the sunset after beating the odds and blazing her own path. On Sunday, August 29th, 2010, about the time most folks are returning home from church, Veronica's boyfriend, Chris, heads over to her house. He and Veronica have plans to take a relaxing afternoon drive, but soon after Chris pulls up to the house...
Honey, you here?
Their plans and lives are changed forever. At approximately 12:30 p.m., patrol officers arrive at Veronica's house and quickly secure the crime scene. Within minutes, seasoned homicide detective Andrew Injachok is brought in to work the case.
I was very surprised to get a call of that nature in the Bridgewater community. It's not a normal Sunday call.
Yep. Hello.
For fellow detective Johnny Crumby, this call hits real close to home.
This subdivision is approximately 2 miles from my residence. It's a quiet area, a nicer area, where we don't have much crime.
At 12:50, the quiet neighborhood is now the site of a full-blown homicide investigation.
Crime scene tape was wrapped around the entire residence.
The streets were lined with police cars and undercover cars. Neighbors were already standing outside.
So, yeah, I got something in the garage I want to share with you guys. Okay. Yeah, this way. I want to take a look.
One look inside, and Detective Crumby gets a vivid mental picture of how he suspects the crime began.
The garage door was open, her vehicle door was open, and personal effects was scattered into the garage, as if there could have possibly even been a struggle until she made it into the house.
From there, investigators follow the path of destruction through the doorway and into the kitchen.
There were additional signs of a struggle. Items were knocked off the kitchen table, and the window curtain was also pulled down on the side door.
I see the victim laying down in a pool of blood over in the living room area. I noticed the couch is moved, chairs moved, some cushions are pulled up. Quite a struggle has taken place inside this area of the residence.
We were able to determine she'd been shot several times in the head and the body.
Watch is pulled from her wrist, as you can see here.
It's a disturbing sight.
You never really get used to seeing any type of violent crime. It always affects you personally and professionally, but it also motivates me that we have a job to do.
The wheels start turning for the detectives.
The first things that start coming to my mind is, did somebody follow her home and try to kidnap her or abduct her? It didn't appear that anything was stolen from the house.
There was a pantry area where several $100s of money was located and some checks that were not taken.
But there's something that police can't find that really has them puzzled.
We determined that Veronica's cell phone was not at the scene, it was not in her car, it wasn't in her purse. So that became an item that was very important to us.
And that's not the only thing missing from the house.
We believe that the attacker had picked up shell casings and taken evidence from the crime scene with him when he left.
As the CSI unit dusts for fingerprints and collects evidence, detectives turn to the closest thing they have to a witness. The man who placed the 911 call, Veronica's boyfriend, Chris.
So you drove up, and what happened then?
Chris was very distraught. He had a full day trip planned with Veronica.
You would want to harm.
And the first thing I noticed, the garage doors were open, you know? And she doesn't ever leave the garage doors open.
And he noticed her car door open, which was even more unusual and strange. And as he progressed into the house, he saw her body and called police.
Chris tells detectives he could see Veronica was dead, so he never touched her body. But they still need to verify his whereabouts prior to arriving at Veronica's house.
Hello?
He told us he was at a friend's residence. He had left the residence. He was on the phone with Veronica, planning their day. He stopped at a local gas station and then again was on the phone with his friend.
When investigators ask about Veronica's son, Chris tells them that he's with his father, Timothy Boza, Veronica's soon-to-be ex-husband. They had met at church that morning to hand off Jordan for the night. Then, Chris tells them something else that piques their interest.
There's something you should know about Veronica's husband.
He stated they were going through a contentious divorce, and that the husband's visitation time was reduced by the courts, and this was a problem for Timothy Boza.
Timothy is next on their list to question. But the two detectives wonder if Chris could be throwing him under the bus to save his own skin.
I suspect he might know something about this.
In this stage of the investigation, everybody's a suspect, especially Chris. He found Veronica. He called 911. At this point, we don't know who he is. We don't know their relationship. We're unsure his involvement with Veronica.
As detectives continue probing for more information, crime scene investigators make an incredible discovery. It's an important clue that undoubtedly could link the weapon to the killer.
That was a huge break in the case. It was almost like receiving a fingerprint for the type of weapon used.
In the shadow of Nashville, Tennessee, the sleepy neighborhood of Bridgewater is sent reeling by the breaking news of Veronica Boza's murder. Making matters worse is the violence associated with the crime. She was shot 4 times, 2 of which were to the head. Hours later, anxious neighbors eyeball the house as police canvass the neighborhood looking for tips.
Should I be concerned or,
Before Veronica's murder, the worst crime I had experienced in this area was a car burglary. I was shocked. We did not know if it was somebody stalking the neighborhood or who had done it.
The tight-knit community is desperate for answers. And while police receive a number of tips to run down, the best break comes from inside Veronica's house. There, investigators find an overlooked piece of evidence the killer left behind.
We find a shell casing that's actually rolled up underneath a baseboard of the residence, sort of hidden from plain view. And that was crucial in this investigation because we didn't have a gun.
Detectives are eager to turn up the heat on Veronica's boyfriend, Chris, to see if he's hiding anything.
We searched his vehicle looking for any type of guns, shell casings, clothing, blood, any type of items that could be related to the crime scene.
Chris's car comes up clean, and nothing jumps out when police run a background check. He even agrees to provide a DNA sample.
Chris didn't seem shifty. He appeared that he wanted to do everything he could to help.
That still did not eliminate him as a viable suspect in the investigation.
After releasing Chris, detectives drive to nearby Greenbrier to notify Timothy Boza that his estranged wife has been murdered.
What?
Timothy had seemed upset at first.
Are you sure it was Veronica?
He was also very concerned about how he was going to notify his son over his mother's death.
I met her after church to pick up my son.
Okay.
Jeez.
Okay, what time was that?
But before they let him do that, detectives want to know where he's been since picking up his son Jordan from Veronica that morning.
Hey, buddy. How are you?
He stated he took Jordan home to his mother's house. He stated he had a plumbing issue, so he had to make some stops and go to 2 different stores, get pop for the kid, and he produced receipts of where he was.
They'll need to double-check his alibi. But first, they ask Timothy to come down to the police station to make a formal statement. When he agrees, the detectives warn him that he's a person of interest in their investigation.
You know, I'm not saying you're a bad person, but I'm saying divorce is ugly. Obviously, you lost a lot in this divorce, you know. In any type of homicide of a spouse, the first person we look at is the significant others. Hey, man, my gut feeling is that you might have had something to do with it.
I can respect that. That's your job, and I want you to do what you're going to, and I'll give you everything you ask me to.
Yeah. We would push him a little bit as far as being a suspect because he is an estranged husband. I mean, that's just, I've been doing this for 16 years, and there's just something about you just doesn't seem right, you know?
I mean, I don't know how to respond to these things. I can say I didn't do it, and I didn't want to.
Despite their line of questioning, Timothy never requests an attorney, and he talks openly about his relationship with Veronica.
It really was still mainly good. Heavy days.
Yeah,
you know?
I understand.
When work's bad, that's when we had our worst days.
He realized the relationship was coming to an end. He had attempted to move on, have a new girlfriend, but he also realized Veronica was now becoming a lot more financially successful, and he was forced to move back in with his relatives to assist in his financial needs.
They also ask for a list of phone calls he made that day.
Yeah, I'm here.
Timothy told us that he's called a business partner and a friend of his a few times that morning, and he stated he might have made some other calls to his mother.
After confiscating his phone to confirm his story, they press with more questions, looking for any tells in his behavior.
Did you have anybody go over there and kill your wife?
No, sir, I would never.
There were really no questions that Timothy refused to answer. He was as cooperative as possible.
I want to be proven wrong. Tell me what you need. I'll give you anything I can.
He even agrees to be photographed and swabbed for DNA testing. But police want to verify Timothy's account of the child exchange and his alibi. They pay a visit to one of the last people to see Veronica alive, Father Joseph Patrick Breen, the priest at St. Edward's Catholic Church. He's devastated when he learns of Veronica's death.
Totally a waste. And what a tragedy. You can't help but have bitterness towards someone that murdered her.
When asked about the morning before Veronica was killed, Father Breen recounts Veronica's last moments with him after services.
Well, it was a 10:30 Mass, over with at 11:35. And she went out there with Jordan out in the parking lot, handed him over to his father, Timothy.
How are you? Here's this bag with all his belongings in it.
Father Breen explains that it wasn't unusual for Veronica and Timothy to meet after Mass to exchange custody of their son.
It was something she did many Sundays, and that's what happened that day.
Timothy's account of their encounter is standing up. As police continue to make the rounds of witnesses, word of Veronica's death spreads quickly, especially among her friends and colleagues in Nashville's music industry.
The reaction from the television and the music community was to pull together, as typically happens here in Nashville.
Country music stars and insiders are shocked. The sense of loss is felt from Nashville's biggest music studios to its gritty honky-tonks.
Nashville takes care of its own. The music community is very, very tight and support each other in their grief and their loss.
On day 2 of the investigation, Monday, August 30th, detectives head north to Greenbrier, Tennessee, where they hope to nail down Timothy's alibi and potentially cross him off their suspect list.
Okay, do you mind if we take a look?
When we had interviewed Timothy, he produced a receipt from a grocery store in Greenbrier near where he lives and spoke to the management of the grocery store, and they provided video surveillance of Timothy inside the store shopping.
In the surveillance video, Timothy is clearly seen making his purchases at 12:21 p.m. The store is approximately 30 minutes from Veronica's house, which puts Timothy far from the crime scene at the time of the murder.
At that point of the investigation, we were starting to rule Timothy out as being the person that actually murdered Veronica.
Now, they want to check the alibi of Veronica's boyfriend. Chris told detectives that he ran into a market on his way to her house.
Do you recognize the picture?
We spoke with the clerk and ascertained that he was there at that point, as he said.
Yeah, I've seen him.
And in the timeline from that stop to her residence, it coincided with the time he called 911.
The clerk's account, along with Chris's receipts, confirms his story. It would be a stretch for Chris to have rushed to Veronica's house, kill her, and dispose of the murder weapon and any evidence before calling the police.
Yeah, hello? 911, yes?
So detectives pursue another path to track down the killer. They turn to Veronica's missing phone and the calls she and others may have made that day.
We knew phone records were going to be an important part of this case, so we had requested phone records for Chris, Veronica, and Timothy.
Cellular systems expert, Special Agent Andrew Valley with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations is brought onto the case to piece together the call history.
The initial phone records that I received for this case were Veronica, the victim, Timothy, the estranged husband in this case, and also Chris Orlando's records, who was the current boyfriend of the victim who found her deceased.
When Agent Valley looks into Veronica's calls, he finds nothing suspicious. But when he turns to Timothy's records, something jumps out.
One thing I noticed is there was somebody that he had talked to several times before the murder and after the murder.
This is likely the friend that Timothy mentions while at the police station.
Did you talk to anybody on your cell phone? Yes, sir. Anybody in mind that I work with? We talked a couple of times this morning.
The number that kept popping up on that day came back to a Corey Cotham.
Agent Valley isn't surprised to see these calls. The surprise comes from his next set of questions. Just who is Corey Cotham? And why is Timothy Boza calling him a friend? It's August 30th, 2010, a day after the murder of Veronica Boza, and her quiet neighborhood of Bridgewater, Tennessee is wrestling with the knowledge that such a horrible tragedy could happen within their fence posts.
We were all on edge, of course. It was very scary. At one time, there were rumors going around that her husband had done it, and I thought, well, I can't believe that.
Police need more than just rumors. But in this case, they, along with Veronica's estranged husband, Timothy Boza's phone records, lead them straight to a man named Corey Cotham.
When we conducted the background check, we determined that Corey had some type of sexual offense out of Oregon in which he was on probation or parole for at the time.
When we discover Corey's criminal history, it raises red flags and makes us want to look further into his possible involvement in the homicide.
Detectives contact Corey by phone and ask him to come down to the police station, an invitation he declines. Not a problem for Detectives Crumby and Injaychuk. They've learned over the years that if a witness is hesitant to come to the police station, they can usually talk them into meeting at a less formal location nearby.
Corey reluctantly agreed to meet us at a parking lot off Gallatin Road because he refused to come to the station.
2 seconds and we'll be out of your hair.
Okay. All right, that's fine. Right here? All right.
If you would, Corey, just start from the beginning as far as when you talked to Tim that day, which was yesterday.
I know I called him first, like that morning, to tell him about the weekend, because we normally tell each other about how the weekend went and stuff, him and his new girl, and I told him about my weekend.
Corey stated he was on his way back from Kentucky from leaving one girlfriend and stayed with Nikki, another one of his girlfriends, and he stated he was with her the entire time.
In response to his alibi claim, they push him even harder.
This is not a good situation at all. All right? And this is serious stuff. This is homicide.
I didn't have anything to do with it. I knew Veronica before I knew Tim.
Detective Injaychuk and I learned that Corey actually lived with Veronica and Tim for a period of time. And so Corey did know Veronica, and Corey said they were friends.
Still, detectives wonder, could Corey have had some history with Veronica that caused him to target her? The possibility is strong enough for them to try something bold. Bait him by insinuating they know he's guilty.
Listen to what I'm telling you, man. Yeah. There's a lot of physical evidence at the scene. There's a neighbor at the end of the alley that's got a surveillance camera. When we get back in town, we're pulling tapes.
I'm telling you, man, I ain't got nothing to do with this shit. This is f***ed up, man.
Despite their suspicions and his curious outburst, they don't have enough hard evidence to arrest anyone. But circumstantial or not, Corey's past record of attacking women is too much to ignore.
We asked him to consent for DNA swabs and photographs, which he refused.
We had asked Corey if we could also view his phone. He stated no, and that the phone was now locked in his vehicle in the parking lot, and that he would not grant us access to his vehicle.
So at that point, we advised him that we were obtaining a search warrant for his DNA, photographs, and for his vehicle.
And with the warrant in hand, Corey gives them his DNA sample. Police impound his car with his phone still inside and send it to the crime lab for processing. At this point, they have all they're going to get from Corey, so they let him go. But detectives are puzzled by one question. Why would he want to murder Veronica?
We'd look at jealousy, rage, greed. There's a wide range of motives that could possibly be related to the homicide.
Later that day, using the phone number Corey gave them, detectives reach out to his girlfriend, Nikki Margot, to check on his alibi.
Detective Crumby spoke with her over the phone and convinced her to meet us at a shopping center parking lot close to her residence.
He was there when I got home from work. It was like 4 a.m.
She stated Corey was with her
We stayed at home all day on Sunday. I made him a sandwich. He was there all day.
And then when they got up about the time of the homicide, that she was making lunch for Corey and herself. Nikki was a solid alibi for Corey.
Still, there's a chance something incriminating could show up in the results of his DNA or his phone records.
Once we receive the cellular telephone records, we want to look at the cellular antenna location information.
This tells police where a phone is located relative to the antenna that's transmitting the call. Now, they can track Chris, Timothy, and Corey's movements on the day of the murder. And when investigators look more closely at the cell phone tower data, they discover more than one of them is lying. In the fall of 2010, a week after Veronica Boza's murder in Bridgewater, Tennessee, mourners from around the world pack into St. Edward's Catholic Church.
Thank you all for coming this morning to remember Veronica.
Veronica's funeral was really, really well attended. It was just packed. Everybody turned out, from her colleagues in the music industry to her friends and her family, to say their goodbyes to a really, really good friend.
A loving mother of her child, a faithful
I saw Veronica's son Jordan beside his father's side, and they seemed close.
God bless Veronica.
Timothy moved about the crowd fairly well and indicated a sense of loss and pain.
As for Timothy's friend Corey Cotham, he's nowhere to be seen. But among the grieving is Chris Orlando, Veronica's boyfriend. Though friends and neighbors are drawn together, all quietly wonder who could have committed this heinous crime.
There were those that strongly suspicious of who committed the murder. Combined with sorrow and pain, I think there was an element of anger, maybe bitterness.
Looking around the church, is that person here? Is Veronica's killer right here in this room?
And they're not alone in their suspicions.
Detective Crumby and I attended the funeral. We conducted surveillance out in the parking lot to see who would show up and how emotional they were getting.
As the funeral ends, the community of Bridgewater is still searching for answers. Investigators turn once again to Special Agent Andrew Valley, who is piecing together cell phone data for Chris, Timothy, and Corey.
One of the other aspects we wanted to look at was which cellular antennas that they were connecting to in order to show where their phone was when the murder occurred.
When he looks at Chris and Timothy's cell records, he confirms their stories. It's not until Agent Valley looks into Corey's phone data that he finds something useful.
Kept driving down Interstate 40 over here, hit antenna 163, which is right over by Veronica's house. One of the things that I noticed immediately was that Corey was near the scene at the time that we believe the homicide occurred.
Corey's alibi is falling apart. They track his movements throughout the day of the murder, and his story gets extremely muddy.
He initially started out in the morning of the murder at his girlfriend's house in the eastern part of Nashville. He then drove down to an area near the St. Edward Catholic Church and was connecting to an antenna down there for a lengthy amount of time.
After that, Corey's phone heads towards Veronica's house. The towers continue to track him to East Nashville, where his girlfriend Nikki Margot lives. Then, an even greater discovery. Another device follows the same route.
Veronica's cell phone was hitting on towers, also along the same path that Cotham's cell phone was hitting, going to Nikki's house. It was like Veronica was trying to lead us to the killer.
This information is damaging to Corey, but it isn't enough to make an arrest. The cell phone data has a margin of error of 1 to 2 miles.
He was there when I got home from work. It was like 4
What's
a.m.
more, Corey's girlfriend Nikki is sticking to her story that Corey was with her at the time of the
We
murder.
were home all day.
Before they can make their move, Crumby and NJ Chuck must account for the contradicting data.
Okay.
When we have a situation where the technical data and the witness statements don't coincide, it creates more work for the detective to try to decipher the reason.
They need to circle back with Nikki, but she beats them to it. On September 11th, 2 weeks after Veronica's murder, Nikki calls detectives Injaychuk and Crumby.
Yeah, this officer.
I was hoping maybe we could meet up. I need to talk to you real quick.
She needed to come forward and tell us the truth. She didn't need to get more involved in this homicide than she was already getting herself involved in.
I could probably come up there.
Nikki comes down to the police station to explain herself.
I just want to tell you the truth about when I got home.
She stated that she lied in her first interview and that Corey was not with her the whole entire time, as stated earlier.
I don't know where he's been.
The real story, according to Nikki, is a far cry from the tale Corey wants police to believe.
Nikki told us she'd been working all night and was exhausted. She came home, went to bed.
She stated she woke up and realized her car keys to her van were gone and that Corey wasn't there. She fell back asleep and then woke up later on and was starting to prepare for her day, and then Corey arrived.
Nikki unloads the truth without any hesitation.
She almost seemed relieved. She seemed a little frightened of Corey. She also wanted to be very helpful when she realized that Veronica had a son and she wanted to assist in the investigation.
They've confirmed Corey is lying. Now police need evidence to link him to the murder. And it turns out Nikki can help provide the smoking gun.
We learned that a firearm was reported stolen from Winston Price, Nikki's husband. Nikki admitted to taking that firearm, placed it in a red lunch cooler, and placed that in her van.
She took the pistol from her ex-husband for protection. And it's the same caliber as the murder weapon.
She figured the gun was still marital property, but that now the gun was missing.
Now that she's cooperating, police let Nikki go. Under the condition she agrees to assist further if needed. The detectives immediately contact Winston Price, Nikki's ex-husband.
We had asked Winston if he had ever fired the weapon. He explained he had, that he owned property at an old farm down in southern part of Tennessee, and he had shot the weapon at the farm. And there's possibly shell casings located on this property.
Crumby and Injaychuk search the farm in hopes of finding shell casings that match the one found at the crime scene. It's the hard evidence they need to tie the weapon to Veronica's murder.
This seems to be a hot spot right in here.
We are able to, luckily after half a day of searching and digging, we recovered shell casings that we then took back to the TBI in Nashville.
Back at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's lab, police find out they hit the jackpot.
When we found out that the shell casings were a match to the shell casing left at the homicide, it was pretty much the aha moment.
They still need evidence that connects the gun to the murderer, and they get it from two sources. First, they find a picture of the gun on Corey's cell phone, which police had already confiscated. Then, they learn about a neighbor of Corey's, Eric Bolin.
And Corey came to him with a handgun that was similar to the one in the photographs off Corey's phone. He described how he cleaned this handgun, that the handgun was in a red, soft lunch pail cooler.
The very cooler that Nikki described to police.
So we were able to put a handgun in Corey's possession that was the same style and type of handgun that was used in Veronica's homicide.
They now have enough evidence to arrest Corey for Veronica's murder. But he's hiding out, so detectives get Nikki to assist in his capture by talking to him on the phone.
Hello?
They got some sort of bullet and it matches the same thing, exact match as one that they found at the crime scene. When are you supposed to be leaving town? Can I go with you? I need to do something for you. They're going to come and arrest me.
With her help, police close in and track him down. But this mystery is far from over. Corey is about to reveal a twist right out of a Hollywood movie. And it's so devious, everyone in town is horrified by the surprise. "3 weeks after the murder of Veronica Boza, Police are closing in on prime suspect Corey Cotham, now with the help of his girlfriend, Nikki Margot, who's keeping him on the phone and distracted.
I'm freaking out. You need to help me out now.
But listen, all you can do is go someplace and chill. If they're looking for you, go someplace they're not looking for you.
When he finally sees police approaching his hideout, he reveals something to her that no one is expecting to hear.
Marshals are here, babe. Listen, get in touch with Tim. Let them know what's going on.
Corey is trying to warn Veronica's estranged husband, Timothy Boza. Little does he realize he's just pointed the finger at his friend. Police now have reason to train their sights on the one man few believed had anything to do with Veronica's murder, the father of her son, Timothy Boza. Detectives start by questioning people who have business dealings with Tim and learn that he's struggling to make ends meet. When they track down Tim and Veronica's financial planner, he tells them about a suspicious conversation the two had in a rather uncomfortable setting.
Yeah, I just wanted to check on the status of that, the insurance.
A financial advisor told us that Tim came to him at the funeral and asked him about the life insurance policy.
Let's talk about this maybe next week.
It fit into the picture of Tim having financial troubles and needing the money.
This conversation gives police the motive they've needed to bring this case to Assistant District Attorney Thomas Thurman.
I think he saw this could solve all of his problems. He would get custody of his son. He would get revenge on his wife for leaving him, and he would get a large amount of windfall of money.
It's enough to arrest Timothy for criminal homicide and question him again, this time with his attorney.
Basically, we're just here to kind of follow up a little bit on the statement you gave us a few weeks ago.
During our second interview with Tim, we asked him to lay out what happened. His attorney told Tim just to tell the truth.
I didn't know what to do. I'm sorry. I've lied to everybody here. I admit it. Because I just didn't know what to do.
And the truth, it turns out, reads like a Hollywood script. In fact, it's ripped directly from a cheesy comedy with two bumbling idiots.
There was a movie years ago that Billy Crystal and Danny DeVito did. It was called Throw Mama from the Train. They both had terrible wives, mothers, or whatever, and they said, "We'll do this crisscross thing." I said, "Okay, hey, we should do the same thing." I said we were just kind of messing. There was no kind of arrangement.
My initial reaction when Timothy explained that this was based on a movie was almost just sheer ridiculousness.
Ridiculous, yes. Which is why Tim claims he never expected Corey to follow through.
But he told me that he did it. He said she tried to run, that she put up a fight.
But they have no reason to believe him. The fact is, Timothy never told police about Corey's plan.
If we had gotten off, I would have probably given him money.
For the prosecution, it's enough to go after both of them. At Corey's trial, Assistant District Attorney Thomas Thurman presents his case. Based on the evidence, this is what police believe happened on the morning of August 29th, 2010.
Veronica took her son and went to church. Plan was to drop the son off with Tim. Corey was there, parked, overlooking the church. Veronica, after church, transferred her son to Tim and then drove home.
As Timothy heads to the store to create an alibi, Corey follows Veronica home. He turns off his phone before getting to her house.
Corey then followed her to the residence where he approached her in the garage.
He rushed in on her in the garage, scared her as she was exiting her vehicle, and I believe she possibly fought some in the garage and was able to fight her way in the house.
She left her purse and everything. She was just in flight trying to save her life.
Once inside, Corey overpowers her in the living room, shooting her several times. Covering his tracks, Corey picks up the shell casings from the crime scene. But he makes a critical mistake by missing one.
Really turned out to be the most important piece of evidence from the crime scene was a shell casing that was left there.
But Corey wasn't done making mistakes. His next blunder was taking Veronica's phone, which tracks him back to his girlfriend's apartment.
We were able to theorize that Corey had stopped at the church and put her phone into the dumpster.
Corey Cotham is found guilty of first-degree murder and especially aggravated robbery. His girlfriend, Dickie Margot, testifies for the prosecution, but is not charged in relation to the crime. Corey receives life without parole, plus 25 years. 8 months later, Timothy Boza is found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder.
Timothy received 51 years for his part in the homicide of Veronica.
Veronica's boyfriend, Chris Orlando, is completely cleared of any involvement with the murder.
This crime had many motives: revenge, hate, greed, jealousy, like a Hollywood movie.
Reaction around town to the news is mixed.
Parts of the community were relieved that they've been found guilty and they're going to be spending the rest of their life behind bars. But parts of the community were shocked and saddened that Timothy was involved with his wife's death.
When people learned that Timothy set this whole thing up, I think they were just shocked. People just never expected that that was something that Veronica's husband would do.
Tragically, the aftermath of this horrible crime is a shattered young life.
There are a number of tragedies, but I think the main one is that Veronica is no longer able to be a mother to a child that she loved so much.
Though neighbors in Bridgewater resume their normal routine, their comfortable, idyllic life will never truly be the same again.
A murder like this destroys a community by taking away their safety and their security.
I have mixed feelings. When I look at the house, I think of the happiness that there was at one time, and then the tragedy that occurred, and I can't forget of what had happened.
For more than 4 decades, one question remained unanswered. Who took Roxanne Wood away from her family? It was a question that refused to disappear, a question that followed investigators through years of uncertainty, through changing technology, through generations of detectives who inherited a case that seemed frozen in time. In the beginning, Roxanne Wood was not a name attached to a cold case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a person with dreams, routines, and a future that was suddenly stolen. Her family knew her as Roxanne, a young woman whose life was filled with ordinary moments, the kind of moments that seem insignificant until they become the memories people cling to forever. A conversation, a smile, a familiar voice, small details that become priceless after someone is gone. But one day, everything changed. A disappearance became a nightmare, and a nightmare became one of the most painful mysteries a family could endure. For Roxanne's loved ones, the passing years did not bring closure. Instead, each anniversary became another reminder that someone responsible had never been held accountable. While the world moved forward, they remained trapped in the same unanswered question. What happened to Roxanne Wood? The case began in an era very different from today. Investigators did not have the advanced forensic tools now considered standard in criminal investigations. There were no modern DNA databases capable of instantly connecting evidence across decades. There were no digital records, no advanced genealogy techniques, no technology that could reopen doors that had been closed for years. There was only the evidence left behind. There were only the memories of those who knew Roxanne. And there was a family waiting for answers. The investigation began with urgency. When someone disappears under suspicious circumstances, the first hours and days can be critical. Detectives search for witnesses. They reconstruct movements. They examine relationships, routines, and every possible clue that could reveal what happened. But as time passed, the answers did not come. The trail grew colder. The case entered a painful category familiar to law enforcement agencies around the world. The cold case. A case where the passage of time becomes both the greatest enemy and sometimes the unexpected ally. Because while memories fade and witnesses become harder to find, evidence can survive. A single piece of evidence can wait silently for decades. And sometimes, decades later, that evidence speaks. For years, Roxanne Wood's case remained unresolved. Investigators continued to examine information, follow leads, and review details that might provide a breakthrough. But the mystery surrounding her death remained. For Roxanne's family, the uncertainty created a unique kind of suffering. There's a difference between grief and unanswered grief. When a loved one dies, families mourn the person they lost. But when the circumstances surrounding that death remain unknown, the pain carries another layer, a constant search for truth. Questions remain unfinished. Memories remain interrupted. There is no final chapter. There is only waiting. The community surrounding Roxanne's case also felt the impact. Crimes that remain unsolved do not affect only one household. They leave entire communities searching for reassurance. They create fear, suspicion, and a feeling that something unresolved remains hidden beneath everyday life. A person responsible for a terrible crime may still be somewhere in the world. A secret may still be protected. And justice may still be delayed. But cold cases are never truly forgotten. Behind every file number is a human life. Behind every piece of evidence is a story. And behind every investigation is a family hoping that one day someone will finally uncover the truth. As years became decades, the world around the case changed dramatically. Technology advanced. Scientific methods improved. Investigators gained access to tools that previous generations could only imagine. DNA analysis transformed criminal investigations. Evidence once considered impossible to use became valuable again. A small biological sample could provide information that changed everything. A clue overlooked decades earlier could become the key that unlocked an entire investigation. Across the United States and around the world, old cases began to move again. Families who had waited 20, 30, even 40 years began receiving answers. For some, those answers brought justice. For others, they brought the painful confirmation of what they had always feared. But at least they knew. And for families like Roxanne Wood's, knowing the truth mattered. Because justice is not only about punishment. It is about recognition. It is about acknowledging that a victim's life mattered, that their story mattered, that their disappearance was never forgotten. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's death would eventually become part of a larger story about perseverance, technology, and the determination of investigators who refused to allow time to erase a crime. The passage of 43 years may seem like an impossible barrier. But for those searching for answers, time was not the end of the investigation. It was only another chapter. Every cold case carries hidden questions. Who knew the victim? Who had information but remained silent? What detail was missed? What evidence survived? And what finally caused the case to move forward after so many years? For Roxanne Wood's family, those questions represented a lifetime of waiting, a lifetime of hoping, a lifetime of wondering whether the person responsible would ever be identified. The world had changed many times since the investigation began. Technology had evolved. Communities had changed. Investigators who first handled the case may have retired or passed the responsibility to new generations. But one thing remained unchanged: the search for justice. Because even after 4 decades, Roxanne was not just a forgotten name in an old case file. She was still someone's loved one. She was still someone who deserved answers. And somewhere inside the evidence collected long ago, investigators believed there might still be a path forward. A path that could finally reveal what happened. A path that could finally bring a family the truth they had waited decades to hear. For 43 years, the question remained: who was responsible for the death of Roxanne Wood? And after all that time, the answer was finally beginning to emerge. For decades, the name Roxanne will remain connected to one of the most painful words in criminal investigation: unsolved. A case without answers. A family without closure. a community left with questions that refuse to disappear. But behind every cold case is a timeline, a sequence of moments that investigators must reconstruct piece by piece. Every movement, every conversation, every decision made before the crime occurred can become a potential clue. And in the investigation into Roxanne Wood's death, understanding the person she was became one of the most important parts of understanding what happened to her. Because before she became the center of a decades-long investigation, Roxanne was simply a person living her life. She had relationships. She had people who cared about her. She had plans for the future. Like many victims whose stories later become part of criminal investigations, her life was reduced by headlines to the circumstances of her death. But investigators and her family knew there was much more to her than the tragedy that followed. She was not a case number. She was Roxanne. And every investigation begins with the same fundamental question. Who was the victim? The answer can reveal patterns. It can identify possible suspects. It can expose hidden conflicts. And sometimes, it can reveal the final moments before a person's life was taken away. In the early stages of the investigation, detectives worked to rebuild Roxanne's final known movements. They examined the people around her, the places she visited, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. These early hours and days were critical. Every missing person investigation begins with uncertainty. A person may have left voluntarily. They may have encountered an accident, or they may have become the victim of a crime. Investigators must consider every possibility. But when evidence begins pointing toward foul play, the nature of the investigation changes completely. The search is no longer simply about finding someone. It becomes a search for the person responsible. And that search can become incredibly complex. In Roxanne Wood's case, the investigation would eventually face the same challenges that many long-term homicide investigations encounter. Time, limited evidence, changing circumstances, and the painful reality that people who may have known something might no longer be available to answer questions. The passage of years can create enormous obstacles. Witnesses move away. Memories become uncertain. Physical evidence can deteriorate. Records disappear. But investigators working cold cases understand something important. Time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it preserves it. A piece of evidence collected decades earlier may remain untouched, waiting for technology to catch up. A detail dismissed in the past may become significant in the future. A name mentioned once may eventually become a connection that investigators need. This is why cold cases are never truly closed unless every possible avenue has been exhausted. For Roxanne's family, the years following her death were filled with uncertainty. They had to continue living while carrying a loss that never received a complete explanation. Birthdays passed. Holidays passed. Years turned into decades. But the questions remained. Who was responsible? Why did this happen? Could the truth ever be discovered? Families of victims often describe this experience as living between two worlds. One world where life continues. Another where the tragedy remains frozen in time. For investigators, cold cases require patience and determination. They require returning to old evidence with new eyes. They require examining what previous investigators may have seen differently because they did not have access to modern technology. The reopening of old cases often begins quietly. A detective reviews a file. A forensic specialist examines evidence again. A database search produces a possible connection. A forgotten detail suddenly becomes important. There is rarely a single dramatic moment at the beginning. Instead, breakthroughs often come from hundreds of small pieces finally coming together. For years, Roxanne Wood's case represented that challenge. The original investigation had been unable to provide the answers her family desperately wanted. The person responsible remained unidentified, and the mystery continued. But advances in forensic science were changing the way investigators looked at unsolved crimes. DNA technology became one of the most powerful tools in modern law enforcement. Evidence that once seemed limited could now reveal information about individuals connected to a crime. Scientific developments allowed investigators to revisit old cases with possibilities that did not exist when the crimes first occurred. The past could be examined through the lens of the present. And that meant a case from decades earlier was no longer frozen forever. It could move again. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's death became part of this new era of criminal investigation, a time when persistence and technology began bringing answers to families who had waited far too long. But solving a decades-old crime requires more than science. It requires people willing to continue searching. Detectives who refuse to accept that time has won. Analysts who carefully examine every piece of information. Families who continue to speak the victim's name. Because memory itself can become a form of evidence. When a victim's story remains alive, the possibility of justice remains alive as well. For Roxanne's loved ones, the hope never completely disappeared. Even after 43 years, they wanted the world to remember that behind the investigation was a person, a life interrupted, a family changed forever, a daughter who should have had more time. The pursuit of justice was not only about finding the person responsible. It was about restoring a sense of truth. It was about answering the question that had haunted everyone connected to the case. What really happened? As investigators continued examining the evidence, the mystery surrounding Roxanne Wood began to narrow. The decades of uncertainty had created distance between the crime and the investigation. But modern techniques had the power to close that distance. The case that once seemed impossible was no longer frozen. The evidence was being revisited. The unanswered questions were being challenged. And the search for the truth entered a new chapter. After 43 years of silence, investigators were finally moving closer to the answers Roxanne Wood's family had waited a lifetime to receive. But before justice could arrive, there were still obstacles ahead. There were still unanswered questions. There were still details that needed to be uncovered. And there was still one final mystery that had remained hidden for more than 4 decades. Who was the person behind the crime that took Roxanne Wood away? For years, the investigation into Roxanne Wood's death existed in a painful space between memory and uncertainty. The people who loved her carried the emotional weight of losing someone they cared about. Investigators carried the responsibility of finding answers. And somewhere between those two realities was a case file filled with questions that had remained unanswered for decades. But every cold case has a moment when the past begins to speak again. Sometimes it begins with new technology. Sometimes it begins with a new investigator looking at old evidence from a different perspective. And sometimes it begins with the simple decision to never stop searching. The murder of Roxanne Wood was not forgotten. Her name remained attached to a case that represented everything families fear after losing a loved one. Not only the tragedy itself, but the silence that follows. For the investigators who continued working the case, the goal was always the same. Find the truth. Identify the person responsible. Bring justice to Roxanne. The challenge was that decades had passed. A crime scene that once contained immediate clues had become a historical record. People connected to the investigation had moved on. Memories that were once clear had become harder to rely on. But investigators knew something important. The answers were somewhere. The evidence had already been collected. The story had already happened. The task was to uncover what had been hidden. Cold cases often require investigators to think differently. Unlike active investigations where detectives can immediately question witnesses and follow fresh leads, old cases demand patience. Every detail must be reconsidered. Every possibility must be examined again. A name in an old report. A statement made years earlier. A piece of physical evidence stored away. Something that once seemed insignificant may suddenly become the most important clue. Modern forensic science transformed this process. The advancement of DNA technology changed criminal investigations forever. Evidence that once could not provide meaningful information could later become a powerful investigative tool. A biological sample could reveal connections. A comparison could identify a person. A single discovery could transform a case that had remained silent for decades. Across the country, investigators began reopening old homicide cases using these new methods. Crimes that had seemed impossible to solve were suddenly producing answers. Families who had waited years were finally hearing names, finally hearing explanations, finally seeing justice. For Roxanne Wood's family, that possibility represented something they had waited for longer than anyone should have to wait. But solving a cold case is rarely simple. Technology can provide information, but investigators still must interpret it. They must understand the evidence. They must determine what it means. They must build a case strong enough to stand in court. Because identifying a suspect is only one part of justice. Proving responsibility is another. Every successful cold case investigation requires a careful balance between science and traditional detective work. Evidence may provide a direction, but investigators must follow that direction. They must reconstruct the past. They must answer questions that have remained unanswered for decades. Who was connected to the victim? Who had the opportunity? Who had a motive? Who knew something but never came forward? These questions become the foundation of the investigation. And for Roxanne Wood's case, the search for answers required looking back through years of information. The investigators studying the case were not only examining what happened, they were examining what had been missed. Because sometimes the key to solving a crime is not discovering something new. It is seeing something old in a completely different way. The passage of time created another challenge. People change. Lives change. Someone who was once young may now be elderly. Someone who once lived nearby may now be thousands of miles away. Someone who once believed they could escape responsibility may discover that time has not erased the evidence. For decades, cold case investigators have seen the same pattern. Crimes believed to be forgotten can return. The past can catch up. And justice can arrive long after people expected it. For Roxanne's family, every year without answers carried emotional consequences. There is a particular pain that comes with not knowing. When a person disappears or is killed under mysterious circumstances, families often create their own theories. They replay memories. They analyze conversations. They wonder if something was overlooked. They ask themselves questions that have no easy answers. Could something have been done differently? Could someone have noticed something? Could the truth have been discovered sooner? These questions can remain for a lifetime. But the reopening of cold cases provides something powerful. Hope. Hope that the truth can still be found. Hope that victims are still remembered. Hope that justice does not have an expiration date. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's murder became a reminder of that principle. A case does not become less important because time passes. A victim does not become less important because years go by. And a family's need for answers does not disappear simply because decades have passed. As investigators continued working, the focus moved toward the evidence that could finally reveal what happened. The details surrounding Roxanne's death were carefully examined again. Every available piece of information became important. Every possibility had to be considered. The investigation was no longer limited by the technology available decades earlier. The past was being examined with the tools of the present. And that changed everything. The possibility of resolution, once distant, became closer. For years, Roxanne Wood's case represented uncertainty. But now, it represented something else. A chance. A chance to finally identify the person responsible. A chance to provide answers. A chance to end the painful waiting that had lasted more than 4 decades. The road to justice had been long. It had been filled with silence, frustration, and unanswered questions. But investigators continued forward. Because behind every cold case is a promise. A promise that victims will not be forgotten. A promise that families will not be abandoned. A promise that even after decades, the truth can still emerge. And for Roxanne Wood, after 43 years of waiting, that moment was finally approaching. The investigation was entering its most critical stage. The evidence was beginning to reveal a clearer picture. The mystery that had remained hidden for so long was starting to break apart. And soon, the question that had haunted Roxanne's family for generations would finally have an answer. For 43 years, the murder of Roxanne will remain a haunting question. A question written inside a case file. A question carried by investigators who refused to let the passage of time erase a victim's story. And a question that followed a family through decades of birthdays, holidays, and ordinary days that were forever changed by one terrible moment. Who was responsible? For many cold cases, the greatest enemy is time. Time changes everything. People forget details. Evidence becomes harder to locate. Witnesses disappear from the picture. And the world moves forward, while families remain connected to the moment their lives change forever. But time can also create unexpected opportunities. New technology can uncover what earlier investigators could not see. New methods can reveal what was hidden. And new generations of investigators can continue the work started by those who came before them. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's death became an example of how determination can survive even when answers seem impossible. The case was no longer only about what happened decades earlier. It was about finding the missing pieces that could finally complete the story. Investigators returned to the evidence with a different perspective. They examined the information collected during the original investigation. They studied reports. They reviewed details. They searched for connections that may have remained invisible in the past. In a cold case, every piece matters. A forgotten statement. A small inconsistency. A name that appeared briefly in an old document. A piece of physical evidence stored away for years. Nothing can be ignored, because sometimes the smallest detail becomes the key that unlocks everything. Advances in forensic science had already changed the way law enforcement approached unsolved crimes. DNA analysis, in particular, transformed investigations around the world. Before these advancements, many cases reached a point where detectives had exhausted every possible lead. The evidence existed, but it could not provide enough information to identify a suspect. Then science changed. The same evidence that once represented the end of an investigation became the beginning of a new one. Cold cases began moving again. Old mysteries began producing new answers. And families who had spent years wondering whether justice would ever come began hearing the words they had waited for. There is a breakthrough. For Roxanne Wood's case, the search for justice required patience. Investigators understood that solving a decades-old crime demanded more than simply finding a name. They needed a complete picture. They needed to understand the circumstances surrounding the crime. They needed to establish connections between evidence and the person responsible. They needed to make sure the truth could withstand the highest level of examination. Because justice delayed still requires justice done correctly. The investigation was not about creating an easy answer. It was about finding the right answer. And that meant following the evidence wherever it led. Over the years, investigators working cold cases have learned that criminals often believe time is their protection. They believe memories will fade. They believe evidence will disappear. They believe the world will forget. But they underestimate one thing: the determination of those searching for the truth. A family's grief can last a lifetime. An investigator's commitment can last a career, and evidence can survive longer than anyone expects. The murder of Roxanne would remain unresolved for decades, but the investigation never truly ended. The case continued to exist. The records remained. The questions remained. And the possibility of justice remained. For those who worked on the case, Roxanne was not simply a victim from the past. She was a person whose life deserved recognition, a person whose story deserved to be told, a person whose family deserved answers. This perspective is what drives many cold case investigators. They understand that behind every investigation is a human being, someone who had hopes, someone who had relationships, someone whose future was taken away. The purpose of solving these cases is not only to identify offenders, it is also to restore dignity to victims, to make sure their names are remembered for more than the tragedy that ended their lives. As investigators continued searching for answers, the case began to move into a new era. The traditional methods of investigation were combined with modern science. Old evidence was viewed through new technology. Historical records were examined with fresh attention. The past and present came together. And slowly, the distance between the crime and the truth began to disappear. For Roxanne's family, every new development carried a mixture of emotions: hope, fear, relief, pain. After decades of waiting, the possibility of answers was no longer just a dream. But answers also meant confronting painful memories. It meant returning to the darkest chapter of their lives. It meant finally learning details that they had wondered about for years. Closure is complicated. For many families, closure does not erase grief. It does not bring back the person they lost. But it can provide something that uncertainty cannot: the truth. The truth allows families to stop searching. It allows them to replace endless questions with facts. It allows them to say that the person responsible is finally held accountable. For Roxanne Wood's loved ones, that moment represented the end of a journey that had lasted more than 4 decades. But before that moment arrived, investigators still had work to do. They had to follow every lead. They had to confirm every detail. They had to ensure that the evidence told the complete story. Because after waiting 43 years, there could be no mistakes. The case demanded accuracy. The victim demanded justice. And the family deserved the truth. The investigation that had once seemed frozen was now moving. The silence that surrounded Roxanne Wood's murder for decades was beginning to break. A case that had remained unresolved through changing generations was finally approaching its answer. The evidence was pointing somewhere. The investigation had direction. And the person who had remained hidden for so long was no longer beyond reach. For 43 years, the question had remained the same: who killed Roxanne Wood? Now, after decades of uncertainty, investigators were closer than ever to answering it. But finding the truth would require one final step: connecting the evidence, following the trail, and confronting the person who had escaped justice for far too long. For decades, the murder of Roxanne would remain a mystery that refused to disappear. The years continued to pass. The seasons changed. The people connected to the original investigation grew older. But one thing remained constant: the search for the truth. In many cold cases, there comes a moment when investigators must make a difficult decision. They must decide whether the past still holds answers, whether the evidence collected long ago still has value, whether a case that once seemed impossible can still be solved. For Roxanne Wood, that moment came when investigators returned to the case with new tools, new perspectives, and a renewed determination to uncover what had happened. The investigation was no longer limited by the technology of the past. The evidence was no longer viewed only through the methods available decades earlier. Science had changed. The ability to analyze old evidence had changed. And suddenly, a case that had remained silent for more than 4 decades began to speak again. The process of reopening a cold case is rarely dramatic at first. There are no immediate answers, no instant resolution. Instead, it begins with patience. Detectives carefully examine what is already known. They study old reports. They review previous interviews. They compare information collected from different stages of the investigation. They search for connections that may have been impossible to recognize years earlier. Every cold case is like a puzzle missing pieces. The challenge is discovering which pieces are missing and which pieces were overlooked. In Roxanne Wood's case, investigators had the difficult task of reconstructing a crime separated from them by decades. They were not investigating a recent event. They were investigating history, a moment in time that had already passed. The people involved had changed. The circumstances had changed. But the evidence remained. And evidence does not age the way memories do. A witness may forget. A story may change. But physical evidence can preserve information for generations. That understanding has changed the way investigators approach unsolved crimes. A case once considered exhausted can suddenly become active again. A file placed away for years can return to the center of an investigation. And a family that has waited decades can finally hear that someone is searching again. For Roxanne's loved ones, every development carried enormous emotional weight. For years, they had lived without answers. They knew that something terrible had happened. They knew Roxanne was gone. But they did not know everything that led to that tragedy. They did not know who was responsible. They did not know whether the person involved had ever been identified. That uncertainty creates a special kind of pain, because grief without answers never fully settles. There's always a question, always a possibility, always a thought that somewhere someone knows more than they have revealed. This is why cold case investigations matter. They are not only about solving crimes. They are about giving families the truth they have been denied. They are about making sure that the passage of time does not erase a victim. And they are about proving that justice can survive even after decades of silence. As investigators continued examining Roxanne Wood's case, modern forensic methods became increasingly important. The development of DNA technology had transformed criminal investigations across the world. Evidence once considered too limited could now provide valuable information. Samples that had waited quietly for years could finally be analyzed. Connections that once seemed impossible could suddenly become clear. For investigators, these advancements created new opportunities. But technology alone does not solve cases. Behind every breakthrough is human determination. Detectives must recognize patterns. They must ask the right questions. They must follow the evidence carefully. A computer can provide information, but investigators must understand the story behind that information. They must determine what happened. They must explain how the evidence connects. And they must build a case based on facts. That process can take time, especially when the crime occurred decades earlier. But patience is one of the defining qualities of cold case investigations. Investigators understand that every unanswered question represents someone waiting for justice. For Roxanne Wood, that waiting lasted longer than anyone should have endured. But the investigation continued. The search continued. The possibility of an answer remained alive. As the case moved forward, investigators faced another challenge common in old investigations. They had to separate what was known from what was assumed. Over decades, rumors can develop. Stories can change. Details can become distorted. A successful investigation requires returning to the facts. What can be proven? What can be confirmed? What does the evidence actually show? Those questions guide investigators through complicated cases. And in a case as old as Roxanne Wood's, accuracy was essential. After 43 years, The goal was not simply to solve a mystery. The goal was to establish the truth. The truth about what happened. The truth about who was responsible. The truth that Roxanne's family had waited decades to receive. For many years, the person responsible for Roxanne's death remained unknown. But the advancement of investigative techniques meant that the past was becoming harder to hide from. A person may avoid attention for years. They may believe the investigation has ended. They may believe time has erased their connection to the crime. But cold case investigators know something different. Time does not always protect those responsible. Sometimes, time creates the opportunity to uncover what was hidden. The very years that seem to make a case impossible can provide the tools needed to solve it. That was the hope surrounding Roxanne Wood's investigation. After decades of unanswered questions, the evidence was being examined again. The story was being reconstructed. And the search for accountability was moving closer. The family who had waited through 43 years of uncertainty was finally approaching the moment they had dreamed of. The moment when the mystery would end. The moment when a name would replace a question mark. The moment when justice would finally have a face. But before that could happen, investigators still needed to complete the final pieces of the puzzle. They needed to confirm the evidence. They needed to connect the past with the present. And they needed to confront the final question that had remained unanswered for more than 4 decades. Who was the person who took Roxanne Wood's life, and how had they managed to escape justice for so long? For 43 years, the unanswered question surrounding Roxanne Wood's murder remained like a shadow over everyone connected to the case. A shadow over her family. A shadow over investigators. A shadow over a community that had never received a complete explanation for what happened. But cold cases have a way of changing. A case that appears silent can suddenly become active. A clue that once seemed meaningless can become the missing piece. And a person who believed they had escaped responsibility can discover that time was never truly on their side. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's death entered a critical stage as detectives continued examining evidence through the lens of modern forensic science. The world of criminal investigation had transformed dramatically since the case first began. Technology that did not exist decades earlier was now allowing investigators to revisit old evidence with unprecedented accuracy. DNA analysis had become one of the most powerful tools available to law enforcement. Evidence that had once been collected and stored without producing an answer could now provide new information. A tiny piece of biological material. A previously unknown connection. A scientific result that could change everything. For investigators working cold cases, these moments represent more than a technological breakthrough. They represent a second chance. A second chance for victims. A second chance for families. A second chance for justice. And for Roxanne Wood's family, after decades of waiting, that second chance meant everything. The emotional reality of a cold case is difficult to understand unless someone has experienced it. There is no simple ending. No moment when life immediately returns to normal. Instead, families live with unanswered questions. They wonder what happened. They wonder why it happened. They wonder whether the person responsible is still nearby, living a normal life while they continue carrying the pain. Every year brings another reminder, another anniversary, another moment when the absence feels impossible to ignore. But families of cold case victims often share one belief. As long as the truth has not been found, the search cannot end. That belief kept Roxanne's story alive. It kept her name connected to the investigation. It kept the possibility of justice open. As investigators continued their work, they followed the same principles that guide successful cold case investigations everywhere. They examined the facts. They questioned assumptions. They looked at old information with new eyes. Because solving a decades-old crime often requires challenging the original understanding of the case. What was believed to be insignificant may become important. What was overlooked may become central. What was impossible in the past may now be possible. The investigators working on Roxanne Wood's case understood that the answers would not come from simply looking backward. They had to combine the past with the present. They had to use historical information together with modern science. They had to reconstruct a timeline separated by decades. And they had to identify the person who had remained hidden for so long. This process requires extraordinary attention to detail. Cold case detectives often describe their work as rebuilding a story from fragments. A fragment of evidence. A fragment of memory. A fragment of information from an old report. Each piece alone may not reveal much, but together they can create a complete picture. That picture was what investigators were searching for. The complete story of Roxanne Wood's final moments. The circumstances surrounding her death. And the identity of the person responsible. As the investigation progressed, the case became a reminder of an important reality in criminal justice. A lack of immediate answers does not mean there will never be answers. Many offenders believe that if they avoid detection long enough, they will escape consequences. They believe the passing years will protect them. They believe the world will move on. But investigators know that unresolved cases are never truly gone. They remain. They wait. And sometimes, decades later, they return with renewed force. The advancement of technology had already changed the fate of many cold cases. Victims who had been forgotten by the public were remembered again. Families who had lost hope received answers. Crimes that had remained mystery for generations finally reached the courtroom. For Roxanne Wood's family, that possibility represented something they had carried for decades. The hope that one day someone would be held accountable. Not because the past could be changed. It could not. No verdict could bring Roxanne back. No sentence could erase the pain. But justice could acknowledge what happened. Justice could recognize that her life mattered. Justice could tell the world that Roxanne was not forgotten. As investigators moved closer to the truth, the focus became increasingly clear. The case was no longer only about what happened in the past. It was about what could be proven today. It was about evidence. It was about facts. It was about building a case strong enough to answer the questions that had remained unanswered for so long. The investigation required patience. It required persistence. And above all, it required commitment. Because after 43 years, there was no room for shortcuts. There was only the pursuit of truth. The story of Roxanne would become part of a larger conversation about cold cases across the country. Cases where victims waited years for their names to be remembered. Cases where families carried grief without answers. Cases where investigators refused to accept that time had won. Every solved cold case sends the same message. The passage of time does not erase responsibility. The years may change the investigation. They may make the path more difficult. But they do not remove the need for justice. For Roxanne's loved ones, that message carried deep meaning. They had waited through decades of uncertainty. They had lived with questions that had no answers. They had watched time pass while hoping that someone, somewhere, would uncover the truth. And finally, after all those years, the investigation was moving toward resolution. The evidence was creating a clearer picture. The unanswered questions were beginning to find answers. The person responsible was no longer hidden behind the distance of time. The case that had remained unsolved for generations was approaching its turning point. But even as investigators moved closer, they understood that solving the case was only part of the journey. The next step would be confronting the evidence in court, presenting the facts, allowing justice to decide. Because after 43 years of waiting, the final chapter of Roxanne Wood's story would not be written through rumors or speculation. It would be written through evidence. and after decades of silence, that evidence was finally ready to speak. For more than 4 decades, the name Roxanne would represent a question without an answer. A question that remained open long after investigators had followed every available lead. A question that stayed with a family who had been forced to live with uncertainty. And a question that continued to challenge everyone who believed that even the oldest cases could still be solved. But now, after years of waiting, the investigation was entering a decisive stage. The evidence that had remained silent for decades was beginning to reveal the truth. The case that once appeared frozen in time was moving forward, and the possibility of justice was no longer distant. It was becoming real. The turning point in many cold cases does not happen overnight. There is rarely one single moment when everything suddenly becomes clear. Instead, breakthroughs are often the result of years of persistence. A detective reviewing an old report, a forensic expert examining evidence with updated technology, a new discovery that connects information separated by decades, a decision to look again when others might have accepted defeat. For Roxanne Wood's case, the renewed investigation represented something powerful. It showed that the passage of time had not erased the importance of what happened to her. It showed that her story still mattered. And it showed that investigators were determined to find the person responsible. The process of moving a cold case toward resolution requires careful work. Every piece of evidence must be examined. Every connection must be verified. Every conclusion must be supported. After 43 years, investigators knew that the truth had to be stronger than speculation. It had to be built on facts. It had to withstand scrutiny. Because the goal was not simply to identify someone. The goal was justice. That meant reconstructing the events surrounding Roxanne's death with as much accuracy as possible. Investigators had to understand the timeline. They had to determine how the evidence connected. They had to separate what was known from what was unknown. They had to answer questions that had remained unanswered for decades. In cold case investigations, the past becomes a crime scene again. Old documents become important. Old interviews become valuable. Old evidence becomes a source of new possibilities. The investigation becomes a bridge between 2 different worlds. The world where the crime happened, and the world where science finally has the ability to solve it. This is what makes cold cases so unique. They are not only investigations into crimes. They are investigations into time itself. They require investigators to travel backward through years of uncertainty and reconstruct a story that many believed had been lost. For Roxanne Wood's family, every new development carried the weight of decades. They had waded through moments when hope became difficult. They had experienced the frustration of not knowing. They had carried the emotional burden of a case that had no ending. But now, the possibility of answers brought a different feeling. After years of silence, there was movement. After years of uncertainty, there was progress. After years of asking questions, there was finally the possibility of hearing the truth. For investigators, one of the most important parts of solving a cold case is understanding the victim. The victim is always at the center. Not the headlines. Not the theories. Not the mystery. The person. Roxanne Wood's story was not defined only by the tragedy that took her life. She was remembered by those who knew her. She was remembered by her family. She was remembered as someone whose life had value beyond the circumstances of her death. That understanding is what drives many investigators who work on unresolved crimes. They know that every victim represents someone who mattered, someone who had a future, someone who had people waiting for them to come home. The pursuit of justice is ultimately a pursuit of truth for those who can no longer speak for themselves. As the investigation continued, the evidence became increasingly important. In a case separated from the present by more than 4 decades, evidence becomes the strongest voice. Memories can change. people can forget. But physical evidence can preserve a connection to the past, a connection that may eventually reveal what happened. This is why investigators never completely abandon cold cases, because they understand that one discovery can change everything. One result, one match, one piece of information, one moment when the past finally catches up with the present. For years, many people believe that some crimes will remain unsolved forever. But advances in science change that belief. Across the country, cases that had been considered impossible were reopened. Victims who had waited decades received answers. Families who thought they might never see justice finally saw accountability. Those cases proved an important lesson. Time does not always protect criminals. Sometimes time gives investigators the tools they need. The person responsible for a crime may believe that years have created distance. But evidence does not forget, and investigators do not stop searching. The murder of Roxanne became another example of that determination. The investigation had survived changing generations of detectives. It had survived technological limitations. It had survived decades of unanswered questions. And now, it was approaching the moment everyone had been waiting for. The evidence was leading investigators toward a person connected to the crime. The mystery was beginning to disappear. The unanswered questions were becoming clearer. But solving a cold case is not only about discovering who committed a crime. It is also about proving it. That final step requires presenting the evidence, building the case, allowing the justice system to determine responsibility. For Roxanne's family, the journey toward that moment had been impossibly long. They had waited 43 years for a chapter that should have been written much sooner. They had waited for a name, for accountability, for the truth. And now, after decades of uncertainty, that moment was finally approaching. The investigation that began with unanswered questions was moving toward an answer. The case that had remained silent was beginning to speak. And the person who had remained beyond reach for so long was about to face the consequences of a crime that had never been forgotten. Because even after 43 years, justice was still searching. And it was finally getting closer. For 43 years, Roxanne Wood's family lived with a question that had no answer. They carried memories instead of explanations. They carried grief instead of justice. And they carried the painful reality that the person responsible for taking Roxanne's life had remained unidentified for decades. But cold cases are built on one powerful idea. The truth can wait. Evidence can wait. Justice can wait. But they do not disappear. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's murder had entered a new phase, one where modern science, renewed determination, and decades of preserved evidence came together to challenge the silence that had surrounded the case. For investigators, the task was no longer simply searching for possibilities. It was about connecting the evidence. It was about transforming information into answers. It was about taking the pieces of a mystery that had remained scattered for generations and finally putting them together. The work required patience and precision. Because when a case is decades old, every decision matters. Every conclusion must be carefully supported. Every piece of evidence must be examined from every possible angle. A mistake could affect the search for justice. And after 43 years, Roxanne's family deserved certainty. They deserved the truth. Cold case investigations often reveal an important reality about time. Time changes people. It changes places. It changes circumstances. But it does not always erase the evidence left behind. A person may move forward with their life. They may believe the past has been buried. They may believe that a crime committed decades earlier has become impossible to solve. But investigators know that the past has a way of returning. A forgotten detail can become important. A scientific discovery can reopen an old investigation. A piece of evidence stored away for years can suddenly become the center of a breakthrough. That possibility is what kept Roxanne Wood's case alive. The investigation continued because the questions remained, and because every unanswered question represented a family still waiting. As investigators examined the case again, they had to reconstruct a story separated by decades. They had to understand not only what happened, but how it happened. They had to examine the circumstances surrounding Roxanne's death. They had to determine which evidence could establish a connection between the crime and the person responsible. This process required combining traditional detective work with modern forensic methods, the old and the new, the past and the present, the memories of those who lived through the original investigation, and the scientific tools that did not exist when the crime first occurred. Together, these elements created a new opportunity, a chance to solve what had remained unsolved for generations. For Roxanne's family, the possibility of justice came with complicated emotions. After decades of waiting, they were closer to answers. But answers also meant confronting the reality of what had happened. Many families of homicide victims describe this moment as both hopeful and painful. They want the truth, but the truth can reopen wounds that never completely healed. Still, uncertainty can be its own form of suffering. Not knowing who is responsible, not knowing why, not knowing whether justice would ever arrive. For Roxanne's loved ones, the possibility of finally ending that uncertainty was something they had waited for throughout their lives. The investigators working on the case understood the importance of every step. They were not only solving a crime from the past, they were representing a victim whose voice had been taken away. They were representing a family that had spent decades searching for answers. And they were representing the principle that no case should be forgotten simply because time has passed. The investigation moved forward with a renewed focus. Old evidence was examined. Previous information was reconsidered. New possibilities were explored. The case that once seemed frozen began to develop momentum. And with every step, the distance between the crime and the truth became smaller. The breakthrough in a cold case often begins quietly. A laboratory result, a comparison, a connection. Something that may seem ordinary at first, but carries enormous significance. For decades, investigators around the world have witnessed this pattern. The final answer is often hidden inside information that was available all along. The difference is that technology finally provides the ability to understand it. That is what makes modern cold case investigations so powerful. They prove that time does not always protect those responsible. It only delays the moment when the evidence can finally be understood. For Roxanne Wood's case, the years of waiting were approaching a turning point. The investigation was no longer moving through uncertainty. It was moving toward accountability. The person responsible for Roxanne's death had remained unidentified for a long time, but investigators were now closer to revealing the truth. The questions that had followed the case for decades were finally being answered. Who was involved? What evidence connected them to the crime? How could the case be proven after so many years? These were the final challenges. And they were challenges that investigators had to overcome carefully. Because a successful investigation is not measured only by finding a suspect. It is measured by delivering justice. That requires evidence. That requires preparation. That requires a complete understanding of the events that led to crime. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's murder showed the importance of persistence. It showed that victims are not forgotten simply because years pass. It showed that families do not stop hoping simply because the case grows old. And it showed that justice can sometimes arrive after the longest wait. For 43 years, Roxanne Wood's name remained connected to a mystery that affected her family, a mystery that challenged investigators, a mystery that remained unresolved despite the passage of time. But now, the silence was breaking. The evidence was pointing toward the truth. The investigation was moving closer to a conclusion. And the final chapter of Roxanne Wood's story was beginning to take shape. After decades of questions, the answer was finally within reach. But before justice could be complete, investigators still had one final responsibility: to prove exactly what happened, to show how the evidence connected, and to ensure that after 43 years of waiting, Roxanne Wood's family would finally receive the justice they had never stopped seeking. For more than 4 decades, the murder of Roxanne would remain a painful reminder that some questions can survive for generations. A question that followed investigators. A question that haunted a family. A question that remained unanswered despite the passage of time. But after 43 years, the case that had once seemed impossible was approaching a historic moment. The silence surrounding Roxanne Wood's death was finally beginning to break. The investigation had reached a stage where evidence, technology, and persistence came together to reveal what had remained hidden for decades. For investigators, this was a moment every cold case detective hopes to reach. The moment when years of work begin to create a clear picture. The moment when a victim's story can finally move from uncertainty toward justice. But even when a suspect is identified, the work is far from over. A cold case breakthrough is only the beginning of another difficult process. Investigators must carefully review every detail. They must ensure that every piece of evidence is properly documented. They must establish a timeline. They must demonstrate how the evidence connects to the crime. Because after decades of waiting, justice cannot be built on assumptions. It must be built on facts. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's murder required exactly that kind of careful approach. The case was not solved because of one simple discovery. It was solved because years of information, evidence, and investigative effort finally came together. The pieces of the puzzle had been scattered for decades. Now, investigators were finally seeing the complete picture. Cold case investigations often reveal something extraordinary about the nature of truth. The truth may be delayed. It may be buried beneath years of uncertainty. It may require new technology or new investigators to uncover. But the truth does not disappear. For Roxanne's family, this idea carried enormous meaning. For years, they had lived without knowing who was responsible. They had lived without knowing whether justice would ever come. They had watched time pass while carrying the memory of someone whose life was taken away far too soon. But now, the investigation was providing something they had waited for. Answers. Not the kind of answers that erase pain. Not the kind that restore the life that was lost. But answers that finally replace uncertainty. Answers that allow a family to stop searching. For many families of homicide victims, justice is not about revenge. It is about acknowledgement. It is about recognizing that a wrong was committed. It is about saying that the victim mattered, that their life mattered, that their story mattered. And for Roxanne Wood, after more than 4 decades, that recognition was finally arriving. As the case moved forward, investigators continued focusing on the evidence that connected the past to present. Every detail mattered. Every discovery had to be examined carefully. Every piece of information had to be confirmed. The challenge in a decades-old case is that the investigation must satisfy 2 different moments in time. It must explain what happened when the crime occurred, and it must prove what happened today. That requires a unique combination of historical investigation and modern forensic science. Old records become important. Past statements become valuable. Scientific analysis provides new possibilities. Together, they create a bridge across decades. That bridge is what allows cold cases to be solved. The person responsible may believe years have created distance. They may believe the passage of time has weakened the investigation. But history has shown that time can sometimes work in the opposite direction. The longer a case remains open, the more opportunities may emerge. Technology improves. Information becomes available. New investigators bring different perspectives, and evidence that once had no voice can finally speak. This was the hope behind a renewed investigation into Roxanne Wood's death. A case that had remained unresolved through changing generations was finally moving toward a conclusion. The investigators involved understood the significance of the moment. They were not simply closing a file. They were answering a question that had affected real people for decades. They were bringing a measure of peace to a family that had waited through years of uncertainty. But the emotional impact of justice arriving after so much time is complicated. For families, there can be relief. There can be gratitude. But there can also be sadness. Because no investigation, no verdict, and no punishment can change the most painful fact. Roxanne Wood was gone. The years that were lost could never be returned. The moments that should have happened could never be recovered. Justice could provide answers, but it could not undo the tragedy. That reality is something many families of victims understand. They are not searching because they believe the past can be changed. They are searching because the truth matters, because every victim deserves to be remembered, because every family deserves a chance to know what happened. The story of Roxanne Wood's case became a powerful example of why cold cases continue to receive attention. They remind society that unresolved crimes are not forgotten. They remind investigators that patience matters. They remind families that hope can survive even the longest periods of uncertainty. After 43 years, the investigation had finally reached a moment when accountability was possible. The mystery that had remained unsolved for decades was no longer beyond reach. The evidence had created a path. The investigation had created a case. And the truth that Roxanne's family had waited so long to discover was finally emerging. For the person responsible, the passage of time had not erased the crime. It had only delayed the moment of accountability. For investigators, this was proof that persistence matters. For Roxanne's family, it was proof that their loved one had not been forgotten. And for the world watching the case unfold, it was another reminder of a powerful reality. A crime may become cold, but it is never truly gone. The years may pass. The memories may fade. The world may change. But somewhere, evidence remains. Somewhere, questions remain. And somewhere, the search for justice continues. After 43 years of waiting, Roxanne Wood's story was finally approaching the ending her family had hoped for. A name, a reckoning, an answer. The final steps of the investigation would determine whether justice could finally be completed. Because after 4 decades of uncertainty, the truth had finally found its way back to the surface. For 43 years, the name Roxanne would remain connected to a tragedy that had never received a complete ending. A case file that stayed open. A family that continued waiting. A question that refused to disappear. But now, after more than 4 decades of uncertainty, the investigation had reached a moment that everyone connected to the case had been hoping for. The truth was no longer hidden behind the distance of time. The evidence collected decades earlier had finally found its purpose. The unanswered questions that had followed Roxanne's family for years were beginning to receive answers. And the person responsible for her death was finally being brought into the light. For investigators, reaching this point required more than determination. It required patience. It required a willingness to revisit a case that many might have considered too old to solve. It required understanding that every victim deserves the same commitment, whether justice comes quickly or after decades. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's murder demonstrated the importance of never giving up on unresolved cases. Because behind every cold case is a person whose story deserves to be completed. Behind every evidence file is a family waiting. Behind every unanswered question is a reason to continue searching. The final stages of a cold case investigation are often among the most challenging. Finding new information is only one part of the process. Investigators must carefully connect that information to the original crime. They must establish a clear chain of evidence. They must explain how the pieces fit together. They must prove that the conclusion is supported by facts. In a case that has remained unresolved for 43 years, every detail carries enormous importance. There is no room for assumptions. There is no room for shortcuts. The truth must be built carefully. Because justice is not only about reaching an answer, it is about reaching the right answer. For Roxanne's family, this process represented the end of a lifetime of uncertainty. For decades, they had been forced to live with questions that had no response. They had remembered Roxanne. They had spoken her name. They had waited for the day when someone would finally be held accountable. And now that day was arriving. The emotional impact of a cold case being solved is difficult to describe. There is relief because the uncertainty ends. There is gratitude because the search finally produced results. But there is also sadness because the truth often arrives with a painful reminder of what was lost. No investigation can return the years that disappeared. No courtroom decision can restore the future Roxanne should have had. But justice provides something that silence cannot. It provides recognition. It confirms that what happened mattered. It confirms that Roxanne's life mattered. And it confirms that her story was never forgotten. The conclusion of a cold case is also a reminder of the people who work behind the scenes. Detectives who continued reviewing information. Forensic specialists who examined evidence. Investigators who believed that the case still had answers. Their work represents a commitment that extends beyond any single investigation. It represents a belief that time should not determine whether someone receives justice. A victim from decades ago deserves the same dedication as a victim from yesterday. The investigation into Roxanne Wood's death showed how modern criminal investigations have changed. A case that once seemed impossible could be reopened. Evidence that once seemed limited could become meaningful. Technology could reveal connections that previous generations of investigators could not discover. But technology was only part of the story. The other part was persistence. Without people willing to continue searching, evidence alone cannot solve a crime. Science provides possibilities. Investigators provide answers. Together, they create justice. For years, the person responsible for Roxanne's death remained beyond the reach of the investigation. The passing of time created the illusion that the case might never be solved. But time did not erase the evidence. It did not erase the questions. And it did not erase the determination of those searching for the truth. The resolution of the case sent a powerful message. Cold cases are never simply old cases. They are unfinished stories. They are unfinished promises. They are reminders that someone is still waiting. The successful conclusion of Roxanne Wood's case represented more than an arrest or a legal outcome. It represented the end of a painful journey. A journey that lasted longer than anyone should have endured. A journey filled with uncertainty, frustration, and unanswered questions. For her family, the moment carried the weight of 43 years. Years of wondering. Years of hoping. Years of asking whether justice would ever come. Now, they finally had an answer. The mystery that had followed them for decades was no longer a mystery. The person responsible had been identified. The investigation had reached its conclusion. And Roxanne Wood's name could finally be remembered not only as part of a tragic case, but as a person whose story mattered. The impact of solving a cold case extends beyond the immediate family. It also affects the investigators, the community, and everyone who followed the case. It restores confidence that justice can still be achieved. It shows that unresolved crimes can still be investigated. And it proves that time is not always an advantage for those responsible. The passage of 43 years did not protect the person who committed the crime. Instead, those years eventually became part of the path toward accountability. The evidence survived. The investigation continued, and justice arrived. But even after a case is solved, one final responsibility remains: remembering the victim. Because the conclusion of an investigation should never only focus on the person responsible. It should also honor the person who was lost. Roxanne Wood's life was more than the circumstances surrounding her death. She was a person with relationships, memories, and a place in the lives of those who loved her. The resolution of the case did not erase the tragedy, but it ensured that her story would not remain unfinished. After 43 years, a family that had waited through decades of uncertainty finally received the justice they had hoped for. A cold case had been solved, a mystery had been answered, and a promise made long ago had finally been fulfilled. The story of Roxanne Wood is a reminder that justice does not always arrive quickly. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes decades. But as long as the search continues, the possibility of truth remains alive. And after 43 years of waiting, Roxanne Wood's family finally had the answer they had spent a lifetime seeking. For 43 years, Roxanne Wood's name remained tied to a question that had no answer. A question that followed her family through decades of uncertainty. A question that remained inside an investigation file long after the world moved on. A question that challenged investigators, frustrated loved ones, and left the community wondering whether the truth would ever be discovered. But some stories do not disappear. Some victims are not forgotten. And some cases, no matter how much time passes, continue waiting for the moment when justice finally arrives. The murder of Roxanne Wood became one of those cases. A case defined by patience. A case defined by determination. A case that proved the search for truth does not end simply because years pass. The conclusion of the investigation marked the end of a journey that had lasted longer than anyone could have imagined. A journey that began with uncertainty. A journey filled with unanswered questions. A journey that forced Roxanne's family to live with the pain of not knowing who was responsible. For decades, they carried that burden. They carried the memories. They carried the grief. And they carried the hope that one day, the truth would finally emerge. That hope is what kept many families of cold case victims going. Not because they believed the past could be changed. Not because they believed justice could undo their loss. But because every person deserves the truth. Every victim deserves to be remembered. And every family deserves the opportunity to know what happened. The resolution of Roxanne Wood's case represented more than conclusion of an investigation. It represented the power of persistence. It represented the importance of modern forensic science. And it represented the commitment of investigators who refused to allow time to become the final answer. For decades, the case existed in a world where technology had limitations. Investigators of the past worked with the tools available to them. They followed leads. They examined evidence. They searched for answers. But sometimes the technology simply was not enough. Then the world changed. Scientific methods improved. Investigative technique évoluait. And evidence that had remained silent for years could finally provide information. This transformation changed the way law enforcement approached cold cases. A file that had once been considered inactive could suddenly become a priority again. A piece of evidence stored away for decades could become the foundation of a new investigation. A case that seemed impossible could become solvable. That is the power of never giving up. The story of Roxanne Wood demonstrates an important lesson in criminal justice. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes justice requires time. Sometimes it requires patience. Sometimes it requires generations of investigators working toward the same goal. The goal is not simply to close a case. The goal is to tell the truth. And the truth in Roxanne's case meant finally acknowledging what happened and holding the responsible person accountable. For her family, the outcome brought emotions that were impossible to describe with a single word: There was relief. There was sadness. There was the painful realization that no amount of justice could return the years they had lost. But there was also something they had waited for since the beginning: certainty. The end of the unanswered questions. The end of wondering. The end of a silence that had lasted for more than 4 decades. For families of victims, answers have a profound meaning. They allow memories to exist without being overshadowed only by mystery. They allow loved ones to remember the person they lost rather than only the circumstances of their death. They allow a story to move from uncertainty into remembrance. And that is what justice ultimately provides. Not the restoration of what was taken, but the recognition that what was taken mattered. Roxanne Wood mattered. Her life mattered. Her family mattered. And the search for the truth mattered. The investigation also serves as a reminder that cold cases require commitment. Behind every solved case are people who continued asking questions. People who reviewed old evidence. People who believed that answers were still possible. People who understood that victims from decades ago deserve the same dedication as victims from today. Their work proves that justice has no expiration date. A person responsible for a crime may believe that time creates safety. They may believe that memories fade. They may believe that the world forgets. But evidence can survive. Investigations can continue. And eventually, the truth can emerge. After 43 years, Roxanne Wood's story reached the moment her family had waited for. The mystery was no longer unanswered. The investigation was no longer incomplete. And the case that had remained open for decades finally moved toward its conclusion. But the final lesson of Roxanne's story is not only about the person responsible. It is about the victim. Because every cold case begins with someone who mattered, someone whose life was interrupted, someone who left behind people who loved them, someone whose story deserves to be told with dignity and respect. Roxanne was more than the details contained in an investigation file. She was more than a headline. She was more than a case number. She was a person. And after decades of waiting, her story was finally given the ending that her family had hoped for. The journey had been long. The wait had been painful. The answers had taken far too many years. But justice finally arrived. The case of Roxanne Wood stands as a reminder that even the coldest cases can still hold answers. That time does not erase truth. That evidence can survive. And that families who continue searching can eventually find the closure they deserve. For 43 years, Roxanne Wood's family waited for the world to recognize what they already knew. Her life mattered. Her story mattered. And she would never be forgotten. After more than 4 decades of questions, the silence was finally broken. A cold case had reached its conclusion. A family finally received justice. And the name Roxanne would no longer be remembered only as part of an unsolved mystery. It would be remembered as a story of a life that mattered, a truth that endured, and a justice that, even after 43 years, finally arrived. 43 years. More than 15,000 days. An entire generation was born, grew up, and began raising families of their own while the murder of Roxanne would remain an unanswered question. Children became parents. Parents became grandparents. Police departments changed leadership. Investigators retired. New detectives walked into evidence rooms where aging cardboard boxes carried faded labels from another era. Inside one of those boxes rested the silent promise that someday, somehow, the truth would matter again. For years, that promise seemed impossible to keep. Yet history has shown something remarkable about justice. Justice does not measure time the way people do. It does not recognize anniversaries. It does not surrender simply because decades have passed. It waits. And when the right evidence, the right technology, and the right determination finally meet, Even the oldest silence can be broken. That is perhaps the greatest legacy left by the investigation into Roxanne Wood's murder. It became more than the resolution of a single homicide. It became another reminder that cold cases are not forgotten cases. They are unfinished conversations between the past and the present. Every unsolved homicide represents two stories unfolding at the same time. One belongs to the victim. The other belongs to everyone left behind. For Roxanne, life ended far too soon. For her family, however, life continued. Birthdays continued. Christmases came and went. Family photographs accumulated. Children grew older. Relatives passed away. The empty space where Roxanne should have been never truly disappeared. Grief changes with time. It rarely becomes smaller. Instead, people slowly learn how to carry it. For families waiting for justice, grief is accompanied by another burden, uncertainty. Uncertainty has a unique weight. It asks endless questions. What really happened? Did someone know more? Could the truth ever be uncovered? Would anyone still care after 40 years? Those questions followed Roxanne's family through nearly half a century. When justice finally arrived, it could not erase those decades. It could not restore the years that had been stolen. It could not recreate conversations that never happened or milestones Roxanne never had the opportunity to experience. Justice is powerful. But justice is not time travel. It cannot rewrite history. What it can do is restore truth. Truth matters because it protects memory. Without truth, victims risk becoming mysteries. With truth, they become people again. That distinction is important. Far too often, unsolved crimes become known only through headlines. The victim's name becomes attached to a case file rather than to the life they actually lived. Investigators understand this better than most. Every homicide investigation begins with evidence, but it is sustained by humanity. Behind every photograph in an investigative report is someone who laughed, someone who loved, someone who planned for tomorrow, someone whose absence permanently changed another person's life. That understanding has transformed the philosophy behind cold case investigations across the United States. Years ago, many agencies believed that once enough time had passed, a homicide investigation had reached its practical limit. Today, that thinking has changed dramatically. Evidence is preserved more carefully. Biological samples are retained. Case files are digitized. Investigators recognize that tomorrow's technology may answer questions today's science cannot. The passage of time no longer represents the end of an investigation. Instead, it often represents an opportunity. Every advancement in forensic science creates new possibilities. Every improvement in laboratory analysis offers another chance. Every generation of investigators inherits not only old files, but also old promises. Promises made to families. Promises made to victims. Promises that someone would continue searching. Roxanne Wood's case demonstrates why those promises matter. The detectives who eventually helped move the investigation toward resolution were building upon work started decades earlier. The original investigators documented evidence. Evidence technicians preserved material. Forensic specialists protected physical exhibits. Each generation added another layer. Justice, in many cold cases, becomes a relay rather than a sprint. One investigator hands responsibility to another. The finish line may be decades away, but the race continues. That continuity represents one of the quiet triumphs of modern law enforcement. Cases once believed unsolvable are now being revisited across the country. Every successful resolution sends the same message to families still waiting. Do not assume your loved one has been forgotten. Somewhere, someone may still be working. Somewhere, evidence may still exist. Somewhere, answers may still be waiting. For families living through unresolved homicide investigations today, Stories like Roxanne Wood's offer something increasingly rare: hope grounded in reality. Not hope based on speculation. Not hope built upon rumors. Hope built upon persistence. Hope supported by science. Hope sustained by people unwilling to accept that time should determine whether justice is possible. There is another lesson carried by this story. Memory itself is an act of justice. When communities remember victims, they refuse to allow violence to define the final chapter. When investigators continue reviewing old files, they acknowledge that every victim deserves equal commitment regardless of when the crime occurred. When families continue speaking a loved one's name, they resist the silence that violence attempts to create. Memory becomes resistance. Memory becomes dignity. Memory becomes a refusal to forget. That may be the quietest victory of all. As years pass, buildings change. Neighborhoods change. Roads are rebuilt. Businesses close. Entire communities evolve. Yet, one thing remains remarkably constant: the need for truth. Generations may never meet the victim personally. They may know only the name, only the case, only the investigation. But even then, the story continues carrying meaning. Because every solved cold case strengthens public confidence that justice is worth pursuing, no matter how long it takes. It reminds investigators beginning their careers that impossible cases sometimes become possible. It reminds prosecutors that evidence preserved today may solve tomorrow's oldest mystery. And it reminds families everywhere that unanswered questions do not always remain unanswered forever. For Roxanne Wood, the search has finally ended. The investigation that stretched across 43 years reached a place every family hopes to see. Not a perfect ending. There are no perfect endings after homicide, only honest ones. An ending where truth replaces uncertainty, where accountability replaces mystery, where memory is no longer overshadowed by unanswered questions. Long after courtroom proceedings are over, long after headlines fade, and long after public attention moves elsewhere, one truth remains unchanged. Roxanne Wood was never simply a cold case. She was a daughter. She was a loved one. She was a life interrupted by violence. And for 43 years, the people who cared about her refused to stop believing that the truth still mattered. In the end, that belief proved stronger than time itself. 43 years is an extraordinary length of time to wait for justice. Yet justice arrived. Not early, not easily, but decisively. The silence that had surrounded Roxanne Wood's murder for generations was finally broken, not by rumor, not by speculation, but through the careful work of investigators, the preservation of evidence, and a determination to keep searching long after others might have given up. Perhaps that is how her story should be remembered, not simply as one more cold case solved after decades, but as proof that every victim deserves to be remembered. Every family deserves the truth, and every unanswered case deserves one more investigator willing to open an old file, ask one more question, and believe that somewhere inside the evidence, justice is still waiting to be found. For most people, a cold case is simply an unsolved murder that has gathered dust in an evidence room, a file pushed onto the highest shelf, a photograph faded by time, a victim whose name occasionally resurfaces on the anniversary of their disappearance before slipping back into obscurity. For experienced investigators, however, a cold case means something entirely different. It is not a dead investigation. It is an investigation waiting for the right question. One of the biggest misconceptions about cold cases is a belief that detectives eventually run out of leads. In reality, investigators usually run out of available technology, available witnesses, or available information, not necessarily the truth itself. The truth often remains preserved inside evidence collected decades earlier. The challenge is learning how to extract it. Modern cold case investigations begin with a principle that would have seemed revolutionary 40 years ago. Never assume the original investigation was wrong. Never assume it was complete. Instead, assume investigators worked with the best tools available at the time, and ask what today's science can now reveal that yesterday's science could not. That philosophy has transformed homicide investigations throughout the world. Rather than beginning with suspects, many modern cold case units begin with evidence. Boxes that have remained untouched for decades are carefully reopened. Every item is documented again. Every chain of custody record is verified. Every biological sample is examined to determine whether modern laboratory methods can obtain information impossible to recover years earlier. In many cases, the evidence itself has not changed. The technology has. A blood sample collected in the early 1980s might have been too small to analyze using forensic techniques available then. Today, laboratories can often generate DNA profiles from dramatically smaller biological traces than investigators once believed useful. Likewise, tiny skin cells left behind through casual contact, sometimes called touch DNA, can, under appropriate conditions, provide investigative value where earlier methods could not. This does not mean every old case suddenly becomes solvable. Evidence degrades. Environmental exposure destroys biological material. Improper storage can permanently reduce its value. But preservation practices have improved dramatically over the last several decades, giving investigators opportunities that previous generations never possessed. Yet forensic science alone rarely solves a homicide. Science identifies possibilities. Detective work determines whether those possibilities explain the crime. Once evidence has been reevaluated, investigators begin reconstructing the original timeline from the beginning, not because they distrust earlier detectives, but because hindsight changes perspective. Witness statements are reviewed line by line. Investigators ask a different set of questions than those asked decades earlier. Who was interviewed? Who refused an interview? Who was never located? Who changed their statement over time? What assumptions shaped the original investigation? Human memory is imperfect. Psychological research consistently demonstrates that memory changes over time. People forget details. They unintentionally combine separate events. They become influenced by conversations, media reports, or repeated questioning. Because of this, experienced investigators rarely rely on memory alone. Instead, they compare independent sources, telephone records, employment schedules, vehicle registrations, property records, archived newspapers, historical weather reports, photographs, financial transactions. Each independent source either strengthens or weakens a witness's account. Sometimes the smallest inconsistency opens an entirely new investigative path. One receipt, one timestamp, one forgotten document. Cold case investigators frequently describe this process as rebuilding an entire world that no longer exists. Neighborhoods have changed. Businesses have closed. Roads have been redesigned. Entire communities have transformed. Understanding the environment surrounding a homicide often requires studying historical maps, archived aerial photography, zoning records, and local newspapers to reconstruct what investigators originally saw. This historical reconstruction becomes especially important when evaluating witness credibility. A witness may accurately remember seeing someone walk behind a building that no longer exists. Without understanding the historical landscape, modern investigators can mistakenly dismiss accurate testimony. Technology has changed another critical aspect of homicide investigations: digital evidence recovery. Although older cases predate smartphones and social media, more recent cold cases often contain forgotten digital records. Hard drives, email archive, GPS devices, cell tower data, cloud backups. Even when devices themselves are obsolete, forensic specialists sometimes recover information using modern extraction techniques unavailable when the investigation first began. Still, perhaps the most valuable investigative tool remains something surprisingly traditional: persistence. Cold case units are built around patience rather than urgency. Unlike active homicide investigations, where detectives often work continuously for weeks, cold case investigators may spend months reviewing a single evidence box. They know breakthroughs rarely arrive dramatically. Instead, they emerge gradually. One overlooked interview, one mislabeled photograph, one laboratory report that seemed insignificant 20 years earlier. The cumulative effect of careful review frequently proves more valuable than dramatic discoveries. Another important development involves interdisciplinary collaboration. Earlier homicide investigations often remain confined within a single jurisdiction. Today, investigators routinely cooperate across agencies. Local police departments, state investigative bureaus, federal forensic laboratories, medical examiners, forensic anthropologists, behavioral analysts. Each discipline contributes a different perspective. No investigator sees every detail. The goal is to create an environment where multiple experts examine the same evidence independently. Fresh eyes often notice what familiarity overlooks. Cold case reviews also benefit from advances in forensic pathology. Medical examiners may revisit decades-old autopsy reports using improved scientific understanding. Patterns once considered inconclusive may now carry diagnostic significance. Injuries may reveal additional information regarding weapon characteristics, offender behavior, or the sequence of events. Importantly, these reviews rarely rewrite history. Instead, they refine earlier conclusions using improved medical knowledge. Equally significant is the careful management of cognitive bias. Experienced investigators recognize that one of the greatest threats to solving any case is becoming emotionally committed to a preferred theory. Confirmation bias can lead investigators to notice evidence supporting existing beliefs while overlooking contradictory information. Modern investigative practice attempts to reduce this risk through structured case reviews, peer consultation, and continual reassessment of assumptions. Every major conclusion must remain supported by evidence, not intuition. This distinction becomes especially important when dealing with public speculation. Cold cases often attract rumors. Internet discussion, anonymous tips, media theories. While public information occasionally produces valuable leads, investigators distinguish carefully between verified facts and speculation. An investigation cannot be built upon coincidence. It must be built upon corroboration. Every significant claim requires independent support. That principle protects both victims and innocent individuals from wrongful accusation. Families play another essential role in long-term investigations. Contrary to popular perception, many relatives become important partners in preserving historical information. Letters, photographs, calendars, personal journals, old address books. Family memories sometimes provide investigative context unavailable anywhere else. At the same time, investigators remain mindful of the emotional burden placed upon surviving relatives. Every renewed investigation asks families to revisit profound loss. Balancing compassion with investigative necessity requires considerable professionalism. One remarkable characteristic of successful cold case investigations is their refusal to confuse delay with defeat. A homicide may remain unsolved for 5 years, 20 years, 40 years. That passage of time changes logistics. It does not change the obligation to seek truth. Every solved cold case reinforces public confidence in the justice system precisely because it demonstrates institutional memory. Someone continued working. Someone preserved the evidence. Someone reopened the file. Someone asked another question. Behind every successful resolution stands countless hours of quiet work, rarely visible to the public. evidence technicians ensuring proper preservation, laboratory scientists validating analytical results, archivists locating forgotten documents, detectives reviewing thousands of pages line by line, prosecutors evaluating whether available evidence satisfies legal standards after decades have passed. Cold case investigations therefore represent one of the most collaborative forms of criminal justice. No single breakthrough solves most cases. Instead, resolution usually emerges through accumulation, small discoveries, careful verification, methodical analysis, relentless persistence. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson offered by modern cold case investigations. Justice is rarely instantaneous. It is deliberate. Science continues evolving. Technology continues improving. Investigative methods continue advancing. Yet, one principle has remained unchanged across generations. Every victim deserves the truth. Every family deserves answers grounded in evidence. And every unsolved homicide deserves investigators willing to believe that somewhere, inside an old report, an overlooked photograph, a preserved biological sample, or a forgotten witness statement, the final piece of the story may still be waiting to be found.